You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, and All Things Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking.
The revolution in crime fighting began in 1985 when Alex Jeffries, a genetics researcher at the University of Leicester, with the assistance of Peter Gill and Dave Warrett of the Forensic Science Service, began a process that would eventually be used to exonerate 17-year-old mentally challenged Richard Buckland in the murders and rapes of 15-year-old Linda Mann in 1983 and 15-year-old Don Ashworth in 1986, despite his admission to the Ashworth murder under police questioning. Both murders in Narborough, Leicestershire, England, led to mass screening of the local population, but although no DNA match was secured from the initial screening, it would eventually flush out one of the murderer's work colleagues, who had taken the blood test under the assumed identity of Colin Pitchfork. This led to the killer's doorstep, and on September 19, 1987, Colin Pitchfork, who was 27 years old, was arrested for the double murder and rape of Linda Mann and Don Ashworth, for which he would ultimately receive a life sentence. Colin Pitchfork was released on September 1, 2021, but rearrested just a couple months later on November 19th for breaching license conditions. The breakthrough in crime fighting that put him behind bars, used the first time in a murder case, was able to show the power of DNA in not only convicting murderers and preventing further victims, but clearing the names of those wrongfully accused and sometimes jailed. An excellent 2-part TV drama in 2014 called Code of a Killer would retell the creation of DNA profiling and its successful implementation and eventually forging the conviction of a double murderer and rapist. In 1988 and 1989, Timothy Wilson Spencer would become the first serial killer convicted in America for 3 rapes and murders in Richmond, Virginia, and Arlington, using the DNA profiling pioneered in Leicestershire by Alex Jeffries. Timothy Spencer was found guilty in 3 separate trials for the murders of 44-year-old Susan Tucker, 35-year-old Debbie Davis, and 32-year-old Susan Helms, and he was suspected of more crimes. 32-year-old Timothy Spencer drew his last breath on April 27, 1994, when he was put to death in the electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. The other side of DNA was highlighted in 1993 when Kirk Noble Bloodsworth, who was previously convicted in 1985 for the rape and murder of 9-year-old Don Hamilton in Maryland, was released from prison when DNA proved he was not the donor of semen in the underwear of the victim. The real killer, a man named Kimberly Shea Ruffner, was eventually identified, remarkably while in jail. Kirk Bloodsworth had read about the pioneering DNA work in England that exonerated Richard Buckland and convicted Colin Pitchfork in the Narborough murders, and he requested this technique be applied to the biological evidence in his case. In both cases, it led to the eventual conviction of the real killer, while mitigating the injustice on 2 innocent people.
The next revolution in DNA analysis came in 2003, after the brutal murder and rape of 87-year-old Gladys Godfrey in Mansfield, England in 2002, after an intruder gained entry to her bungalow. Despite another mass screening of the population, after police concluded the perpetrator was local to the area, it failed to produce a hit, when it was later discovered that the man had moved just outside the target area subsequent to the crime. The murderer, 21-year-old Jason Ward, had beaten and raped the widower before strangling her to death, astonishingly having invaded her home 17 months earlier, attacking her and exposing himself. Initially, the DNA had been entered into the national database but had failed to identify the monster responsible for Gladys Godfrey's savage murder, so another approach was developed. Scientists in Birmingham, England pioneered the idea of familial DNA, in which the DNA from the crime scene was entered into the national database with a view to identifying close matches that might unearth somebody related to the murderer. By identifying a set of individuals closely aligned to the suspect DNA, they could search the family tree for the killer. One eyewitness in the area of the murder had noticed a cyclist pedalling in a certain direction during the relevant time period, so this could be used in focusing the search once the long list of close hits had been identified. The use of geographic profiling and familial DNA science, working in tandem with one another to identify the killer's home residence. The list was eventually whittled down to just 20, with the second person on that list a male relative of Jason Ward. In 2003, his DNA was examined and, coupled with his fingerprints found at the crime scene, led to the December 2003 arrest and eventual conviction of Jason Ward. In 2004, at Nottingham Crown Court, Jason Ward received a life sentence with a minimum term of 22 years. Familial DNA would later play a crucial role in April 2018 in America, identifying the Golden State Killer Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., responsible for at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and 120 burglaries throughout California between 1974 and 1986. Much like the Jason Ward case, a DNA fingerprint is only useful if you are able to match it to somebody, and in the case of the Golden State Killer, a search of the FBI's national database produced no match. A few months earlier, using the genealogy website GEDmatch, Detective Paul Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer were finally able to identify Joseph James DeAngelo through a distant relative. 6 days before his arrest, law enforcement had to be sure they had identified the correct individual, so without the knowledge of DeAngelo, they took a DNA sample from his parked vehicle and a tissue from his garbage. Subsequent testing finally secured the capture of a killer, rapist and burglar that had evaded police for over 40 years. He eventually confessed to 13 murders to avoid the death penalty, and on August the 21st, 2020, received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. When used correctly, the power of DNA as a crime-fighting tool is unparalleled.
If DNA is retrieved and correctly stored from a crime scene, or perhaps in the case of the Zodiac, an envelope that he mailed, it can be entered into CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System, which stores the DNA profiles of offenders in a national database. Currently, a set of 20 loci from a known offender are required for the profile, but this doesn't mean that partial profiles from a crime scene can't be entered into the system. When DNA from a crime scene is damaged or degraded, sometimes only limited markers may be found, thereby producing a partial profile. When entered into CODIS, this will inevitably match up with many more people. Even a full profile may match up with more than one person. But using any identifications in CODIS, in combination with other details known about the crime, this should narrow the list even further, and hopefully to the offender. DNA profiling is not infallible, where correct procedure analysis of data and match probability is the order of the day. The San Francisco Police Department produced a DNA chart of suspected Zodiac correspondence sometime around the millennium, with findings on the envelopes ranging from few cells, cells found, and DNA sample obtained. Despite a DNA sample obtained from the April 24, 1978 letter, it appears that little headway has been made since, despite the promise of a new round of testing in late 2017, with Vallejo detective Terry Poyser suggesting they were focusing in on 2 letters mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle and San Francisco Examiner by the Zodiac on July 31, 1969. Since this fresh optimism, nearly 4 years of apparent inactivity has blunted the hope once felt in the Zodiac community that the case might be on the brink of being solved. The letter that arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle in April 1978 after a perceived hiatus of approximately 4 years by the Zodiac, focused its attention on Inspector Dave Toschi, who had spearheaded the Zodiac investigation for many years. That letter read, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. I am back with you. Tell Herb Cain I am here. I have always been here. That city pig Toschi is good, but I am smarter and better. He will get tired, then leave me alone. I'm waiting for a good movie about me. Who will play me? I am now in control of all things. Yours truly." It was followed by the customary crosshairs, but instead of a running victim total, it challenged us to, quote, guess his murder count to date, and it ended with SFPD-0. After the Tales of the City series author, Armistead Maupin, came forward, suggesting Inspector Dave Toschi may have forged the 78 letter to drum up new interest in the Zodiac case, the respected investigator was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. So with Dave Toschi in the clear, who authored the controversial 1978 letter mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle?
The San Francisco DNA chart explicitly states that the 1978 letter is not authentic. Taking their word for it, that Dave Toschi had no input into the 1978 communication, the only way that San Francisco police could possibly know that the letter was not authentic is if they knew that the DNA originated from a female or didn't match another letter they knew was definitely from Zodiac. But if the DNA was from a female, they could have easily reported this in the intervening 2 decades and removed the cloud of suspicion from a dedicated officer that still exists in some circles today. But they didn't, and that is telling. The 2017 search for Zodiac DNA using the advanced techniques of today suggests that law enforcement have never had a comprehensive DNA profile that they trust, hence why they are still searching. If they haven't already concluded this, then they should never have classed the 1978 letter as an inauthentic Zodiac communication based only on handwriting analysis. Handwriting experts cannot agree among themselves on the authenticity of certain communications, and handwriting analysis alone can never be used to say with certainty that an individual is responsible for authoring a letter. It is subjective in nature. If you travel around the Zodiac community, you will, however, find many people who have an unnerving ability to just stare at a communication for as little as 30 seconds and boldly declare it was penned by a hoaxer. They are also often oblivious to any counter-arguments against their position because, quite frankly, they are not interested and do not research these communications for longer than it takes to stare at them. If we want to determine whether a communication is from the Zodiac Killer or to be placed in the not proven file, we have to examine it in relation to other communications that preferably have not been released into the public domain. That means examining the wording and structure of parts of a communication where the imagery of that communication or its envelope has been withheld from the newspapers during the relevant time period. This can be done with the 1978 letter and Melvin Belli letter. Robert Graysmith proposed the notion of a light table for a hoaxer to manufacture the handwriting on the 1978 letter. Document examiners claim the 1978 letter copied or borrowed from previous Zodiac communications, and others state that the 1978 letter is deliberate and contrived, exhibiting all the hallmarks of a copycat. Strange, then, that the author managed to copy or mimic the December the 20th, 1969 Melvin Belli letter, the image of which hadn't been released in the newspapers by 1978, only the text. One would have thought a lazy copycat would have mimicked the "This is the Zodiac speaking" introduction from the October the 13th, 1969, November the 8th, 1969, April the 20th, 1970, and March the 13th, 1971 letters, which were all published in the San Francisco Chronicle. These publications clearly showed the "This is the Zodiac speaking" introduction confined to its own line. This should have been standard fare for any copycat hoping to convince us he was Zodiac, But no, the author of the 1978 letter added the letter I to this line, thereby reading, "This is the Zodiac speaking, I." The only time this had occurred previously in 12 authenticated communications from August the 4th, 1969 to March the 13th, 1971 was the Melvin Belli letter, whose imagery hadn't been published. It can also be noted that the 1978 letter introduction is grammatically incorrect, failing to place a punctuation mark between speaking and I. Exactly the same as the image of the Melvin Belli letter, which would not have been available to a copycat in 1978. However, it would have been available to the Zodiac Killer.
In 1946, 12-year-old Muriel Joan Drinkwater was raped and shot in the woods in Swansea, Wales. Her case was dubbed the Little Red Riding Murder. Muriel had been walking home from school on a path that meandered through the woods when she was last spotted by 13-year-old Hubert Hoyles during the final leg of her journey, having passed Muriel as he left her family farm after buying eggs. Muriel never emerged from those woods. The following day, her body was discovered by a police inspector. She had been bludgeoned around the head and shot twice in the chest with a World War I Colt 45 identified as one of the murder weapons. Muriel's murder remains unsolved to this day, but in 2008, 52 years after the crime, her clothes were found stored in a paper bag, and subsequent forensic testing unearthed the semen stain on the back of her coat. And using a DNA technique called YSTR, a familial DNA profile was generated and entered into the national database, but unfortunately, the case had no resolution. Despite no suspect being identified, Hubert Hoyles, the last person to see Muriel that day, was cleared of any involvement in the crime. Additionally, sadistic child murderer Harold Jones, suspected by some of the Drinkwater murder, was also cleared by a DNA comparison to the semen discovered on her clothing. Although this cruel murder remains unsolved, it demonstrates the durability of DNA in some cases, despite the fact preservation techniques in 1946 are incomparable to 40 years later. It also shows the power of DNA in lifting the burden of suspicion from people long thought of as potential killers. There are many contentious Zodiac letters mailed subsequent to 1971, many of which have the potential to yield DNA from the sealed portion of the communication. So with little progress seemingly apparent with the testing of early Zodiac letters, we shouldn't let our biases on these later letters be a barrier to explore new avenues in the hunt for the Zodiac Killer's DNA.
The same technique applied to the 1978 letter in comparing it to previously unreleased Zodiac material can also be adopted for the Exorcist letter. If the author of the Exorcist letter was a copycat, one would have expected them to mimic part of the envelope addressed to Melvin Belli, released by the newspapers on December the 28th, 1969, or mimic the envelope to the 340 cipher, released by newspapers on November the 16th, 1970. But they didn't. They instead used an address style only ever used on two envelopes mailed in April 1970, never released into the public domain. The punctuation, structure and handwriting from the April the 28th, 1970 Dragon Card envelope is nearly identical to the Exorcist letter envelope, with both using the address of sanfran.chronicle. This effectively authenticates the Exorcist letter as genuine. If both the Exorcist letter and 1978 letter are genuine, it adds some credence to statements accredited to Alan Keel by Zodiac researcher Mike Rodelli. According to Mike Rodelli, Alan Keel, criminalist at the San Francisco Police Department, San Francisco, California, from 1996 to 1999, quote, revealed that there were two letters in possession of the department that, in contrast to the true Zodiac letters, had abundant saliva and DNA containing oral epithelial cells on them, that DNA was easily extracted from these two letters, and that the DNA extracted from these two letters matched between them. These two letters were considered forgeries, since the true Zodiac verifiable letters had not been licked by the sender. According to Mike, Alan Keel had, quote, analysed 2 letters, one of which is the 1978 forgery, and finds that this letter and one of the 1974 letters are loaded with saliva and cells. He then easily extracts DNA from both of these letters using the more primitive DNA technology of that time, and finds that the DNA matches between these 2 letters, thus proving that one person sent both. The fact remains that in 2007, Keel told me, as he had told Lafferty before me, that there is a 1974 forgery based on DNA, and the only 1974 letter that had been tested for the presence of cells during Keel's tenure, as demonstrated by the DNA chart that I believe Keel made in about 2000, was the Exorcist letter. This is not rocket science. Even if it is not the Exorcist letter that Keel was talking about, it is a candidate as being a forgery whose DNA matches the 1978 letter based on the information in the chart. The Exorcist letter envelope DNA may very well match the DNA from the 1978 envelope, but the contention both could be forgeries is not backed up by the arguments presented here. The San Francisco Police Department could submit the DNA we know has been found on the 1978 letter into a national DNA database, and using familial DNA searches, it may identify individuals who had connections to the Bay Area in the relevant time period, much like was done with the case of Joseph James DeAngelo. What have we got to lose? The apparent reluctance to follow this route could be construed as law enforcement already knowing the identity of the DNA on the 1978 letter. However, they can't possibly know unless it matches Dave Toschi, who by their own statements has been cleared of any malfeasance. The arguments presented suggest that the 1978 letter is genuine Zodiac material, indicating that we have had the Zodiac Killer's DNA all along. Refusal to run it through a national or private database based solely upon handwriting would be a crime in and of itself.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
We know the frailties in handwriting analysis, and we know that the 1978 letter has produced a full DNA profile. So what is stopping law enforcement submitting this profile for near matches in the national database, looking for a familial match, i.e. a member of the family or somebody related to the Zodiac? Handwriting analysis is useful, but subjective, and cannot be used in an American court of law to definitively identify a suspect as the author. With this in mind, what have people got to lose by running this profile for near matches that may identify somebody relevant to the location and time of the Zodiac Killer?
Well, I don't know what's stopping them, why they're hesitant. You bring up a good point about the writing. It's very open to opinion. We've seen recently with the whole Riverside stuff that there may be proof there that Zodiac didn't write some of the letters in that case. So it opens up an interesting angle of how much of the writing can we now trust from letters that were previously confirmed or unconfirmed, and in comparison with some of those letters. The 78 one is a good example. You know, that's one that's been technically unconfirmed, and I think we'll talk about that. You suspect that it might be a legitimate Zodiac letter. I would think, and I would hope, that if they have a full profile from the 78 letter, that they would make efforts to determine who that author is, and then do some research on them, do some investigating on them, and determine if they're just a copycat or if they're, the real Zodiac. If they determine the person through DNA that wrote that was, say, 14 at the time, or was a woman, or was 75 years old, we could sort of rule them out based on certain criteria. But if they were a male and the right age and living in the right area, then that would be more interesting. But I think they should determine, if they can, who that author is, and then go from there to determine if the author is Zodiac or not.
Well, in the DNA chart, they listed it as not authentic. Now, we don't know whether it was placed in the DNA chart already having concluded that it was inauthentic by examining handwriting, or whether they concluded it was not authentic by DNA. I think it must have been deemed inauthentic because they just looked at the handwriting. The only way they could determine through DNA is if it probably matched David Toschi, or it was a female, as you mentioned. But if it matched, the DNA matched to a female donor or David Toschi, you would have thought SFPD would have released this at some point instead of allowing Dave Toschi to suffer under the suspicion of having authored this for the rest of his career and afterwards.
Well, and part of the issue is I don't know how much of the DNA work has been done since Toschi retired. He's obviously, I don't remember when he passed away. He's been passed away now for a little while, but he's been retired for a long time. So I think most likely a lot of the DNA developments and research and work they've done came well after he retired. But even if they determined that there was DNA that was someone else's than him, other than him, they should have at least released that statement just to clear his name, even though he was already retired. You would think they would do that. But part of the issue is they're very closed mouth. They're not very open about what DNA matches what letters, and if any prints from letters match prints from crime scenes. They're not very open about that. So we're left to guess a lot of what they're doing and what stuff's been linked and how it's been linked or what's not been linked. And we're left to speculate on that, unfortunately.
Do you feel personally that David Toschi is in the clear for writing the 78 letter?
I think he is. I personally don't think he wrote any of the Zodiac letters. And I think that he was sort of roped into that claim. And unfortunately, I think it was a stain on his character as a detective. But, you know, he had a very good career, and a lot of high credit went to him for a lot of the cases he worked on. And for that to smear his name, I think, was a sad part of this entire saga.
Now, I have been looking extensively at the 1978 letter and found that the author didn't mimic the "this is the Zodiac speaking" introduction, which was always, in every Zodiac communication but one, kept isolated on a separate line. Only once before 1978 did he write "This is the Zodiac speaking I" on the introduction line. This was in the Melvin Belli letter. The normal introduction was published 4 times by the Chronicle, yet the 78 author failed to copy these. He only copied the unpublished image of the Belli letter, making the exact same punctuation error between speaking and I, failing to add a period or comma in either the Belli letter or the 1978 letter. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's definitely an interesting observation by you, and, you know, unless they're 2 different writers and just happen to have poor punctuation skills. To do it correctly, a comma should be there. We know that Zodiac used periods in some of those letters in the right spots, but didn't use the comma, or whoever authored some of those letters used periods and not a comma. But I think there are clues you can see when you look at the letters and things that jump out that they share in common that are worth examining, which I think you've done a good job with, comparing those things and trying to spot similarities and differences.
In the SFPD DNA chart, the early letters in comments have few cells detected, whereas the later letters have cells found in comments, with the 1978 letter stating DNA was obtained. If you go to my site on zodiacciphers.com and type in a pattern of writing into Google search function, you will see a comparison of the 78 letter from April the 24th with the May the 2nd, 1978 letter, the May the 6th, 1986 letter, and the October the 28th, 1987 letter. I think Druza is one of the top Zodiac researchers and has smashed open this case by his observations with indented writing. If these 4 later letters were from multiple hoaxers, then you wouldn't expect all of them to use the "This is the Zodiac speaking" introduction by employing an indented line, never before used in any pre-1978 letters, including the only 4 published in the Chronicle newspaper. This change from 1978 onwards suggests a pattern of one author. The 1987 envelope has been shown to mimic the previously unpublished Vallejo Times Herald envelope from '69. So my question is, why haven't DNA efforts been focused on the later envelopes, which have previously been shown to contain more cells and therefore likely more DNA?
Well, again, going back to the writing examinations, if they didn't think the DNA was worth pursuing this because they thought they were frauds or hoaxers based on documents examiners' opinion, I personally think they should go back and identify the person regardless if they can, and then that takes the writing part out of the equation. They can determine the author, they can go do an investigation, see if they're simply a hoaxer or the real Zodiac. But to your point about those indentations where he starts, just looking on that page in particular that you wrote an article comparing these two, like if you look at the Melvin Belli one, for example, he doesn't have that space starting, where the letter starts off, where the paragraph starts off. It doesn't seem that Zodiac did the kind of spacing that the person in the 78 through 86 letters did, at least as far as I can see. So does that mean that perhaps Zodiac changed his style a little bit and did write some of the 78 to 86 letters? Or could it be that the person that wrote the 78 to 86 letters are all the same person and not the Zodiac? Because again, just looking at some of the Zodiac letters, I don't see him starting those letters the same way that the author did from 78 to 86.
We shouldn't take as fact Mike Rodelli's claims that the DNA from the 1978 letter matched one of the 74 letters, according to the SFPD criminalist Alan Keel. But recent findings have almost certainly authenticated the Exodus letter. If you go to my website again and type in verifying the Exodus letter, you will notice the similarities between the address on the Exorcist letter envelope and the 2 April 1970 envelopes. These are the only 3 envelopes to use the address sanfran.chronicle. The author of the Exodus envelope could not have copied the 2 envelopes from April 1970 because they hadn't been released publicly. The April 28th, 1970 envelope is virtually identical to the Exodus letter envelope, not only in handwriting, but in spacing, slant, and the positioning of the full stop. This effectively proves the Exodus letter was from Zodiac. If the 1978 letter is genuine, along with the Exodus letter, this lends credence to the notion that their DNA would match. If Alan Keel was correct, surely these findings must be documented somewhere within the San Francisco Police Department.
Well, and that's the thing. Unless I see something documented in official reports and I see it with my own eyes, I don't believe it. It's all hearsay to me. I'm not going to take someone's word that I heard this from so and so, unless I see it with my own eyes or I get it firsthand from an investigator that I can rely on. I'm not going to believe it. And based on what you said, I'm 100% convinced that the Exorcist letter is genuine Zodiac.
Do you think the handwriting there looks similar enough to prove it?
Again, since we're talking about handwriting, it's open to interpretation, open to opinion. To my untrained eye, it looks very similar. And not just the formation of the words, but if you look at Chronicle and all 3 samples that you have laid together, the LE has a little bit of a space from the rest of the word. And I watched an interesting interpretation in one of those Zodiac 2007 documentary things where I think it was a linguist sort of looked at the writing from Zodiac, and Zodiac had a tendency to break up his words when he wrote them out, where the syllables changed. And you can see that in Chronicle, the HRNIC space LE, chronicle. It's almost where the syllable emphasis is. He makes a space mentally as he's writing it. And I see that in all three of those words. I mean, the writing itself looks similar, but the spacing between the C and the LE in chronicle is identical to me in all three. So I've never doubted that the Exorcist letter was genuine Zodiac. If there is a fake 1974 letter that's not really from Zodiac, I don't think it's the Exorcist letter. I'm 100% convinced that's a legitimate Zodiac letter.
I mean, there is a distinct gap after San Fran to the dot and then to the C on every occasion. But the point being, yes, I understand the handwriting and its frailties, but what's more important, that he wrote that address that had never been used before. He could easily have mimicked any address from the Melvin Belli letter envelope, which was released, or the 340 cipher envelope, which was released. He could have copied those and used the address of San Francisco Chronicle off those, but he didn't. He used only two that had never been released into the public. So I think what's critical when we're analysing handwriting is using handwriting that had never been released publicly and the author could never have ever seen.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And I think that when you combine that fact with the fact that the writing itself looks similar, the spacing looks similar, it's just kind of hard to dismiss all of that. Again, as long as we're talking about writing, it'll always come down to opinion or something like that. But when you add to the fact that he's using something that wasn't readily available to the public, I think that just strengthens the case with that.
And the reason I'm bringing these two letters up, particularly the 74 and 78 letter, is because of the DNA chart, which states there were more cells, if not a full profile, found on these envelopes, or stamps for that matter. So that's the reason I'm bringing these letters up in terms of DNA, because there's been a long search now for nearly 4 years on the July the 31st envelopes, and nothing has transpired in nearly 4 years. So do you think we'll ever get any results of that, or do you think that's a dead duck effectively?
I think when it comes to getting DNA from letters, from envelopes, I think the technology is always evolving, always changing. So things that right now or a couple years ago that are not possible may be possible 5 or 10 years from now. If they have a limited amount of DNA to work with and they can only do so much with it now, that doesn't mean that 5 years from now they won't come up with a way to make that do a lot more. Right now it takes a really good quantity of DNA to create a profile, one that can be entered into GEDmatch, for example, to do genealogy on and figure out the family tree of someone. And years from now, they may be able to do that same exact process with less of a profile. So I think patience and time in this case can be helpful if we just wait. It's a possibility that in the future something will be developed that will help with the DNA. Now, part of it comes down to if the DNA samples from any letters or envelopes are just too degraded or are too poor or, things along those lines, those may be hard to overcome. But I think, again, we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know what, a couple years down the road, 5 years down the road, we don't know what technologies they'll have that may be able to help with DNA. It may take just a very small sample, even from a degraded sample. They may be able to one day do some things with that will help identify Zodiac.
Well, this may be relevant to you and your suspects because we have many communications from 1978 onwards available for testing. Running these for DNA using familial searching may identify a relevant family member or somebody's suspect or a relevant person who lived in one of the areas of interest. People with suspects should want the 1978 letter examined more in terms of genealogy. If it identifies their suspect, great. If not, They can always claim the 1978 letter is a fake Zodiac communication. What have they got to lose by having it tested?
Well, I agree with you.
And can your suspect, can you find DNA from your suspect? Was he buried, cremated?
Well, I think the more possible Zodiac letters there are, the better for the case, especially if they're newer, if they're 78 to 86. If any of those turned out to be legitimate Zodiac letters, there's a better chance that they will have been stored properly and not degraded, and maybe DNA can be developed that will lead to genealogy identifying them. I think if I was in charge of this case, I would be working to identify those authors of all the 78 to 86 letters regardless. And then I would go back and check each one of them and rule them out properly as being Zodiac. Or is there something there that connects them to being Zodiac? I'm not in charge of the case, but that's what I would be trying to do right about now. Who knows? Maybe they're trying to do that. I don't know. But I would want to identify all the authors of any of those Zodiac letters and see if there's any chance that they're Zodiac. As far as my personal suspect, William Andrew, who's named publicly everywhere, so I don't mind naming him now, he was cremated when he died, which that doesn't mean they can't get a sample from him. They just can't go to his grave, obviously, and pull a piece of his hair or bone or whatever they would use to do DNA testing to compare to the any samples they have. But there's other sources they can use. There's ways they could potentially get his DNA from other places. I don't want to name any of those other options because I don't want to tip off, what police might do and where they would go. I don't want someone hiding potential evidence from him. But there's other ways they can get it. And if it comes down to genealogy, he has plenty of relatives that they can do a family tree on and connect to him. So even when we see people are cremated, there's ways to connect them to cases. We've seen some cases solved through genealogy, through DNA, where the suspect that was responsible had been cremated. And they've still been able to identify them as being the correct person involved in some of these crimes. So it's not, obviously we'd want to see someone alive. That's the easiest way. And if they're not alive, if they're buried and they can get a court order to take some DNA from their grave, that would be the second easiest thing. But there's still options available. Even when someone has died and they've been cremated, there's still ways to get DNA.
You need extremely good grounds to disinter somebody effectively, don't you?
Yeah, you're not going to easily get a court order to just dig someone's grave up looking for
No.
For DNA. The best route, because you can get around some of it, is if you can do forensic genealogy and just you have a profile that you're confident is from the real Zodiac, and you could put that in the GEDmatch. Then you just build a family tree and see who's on that tree, and then you identify the right male that was the right age, that was in the right area of California during the crimes. Then you can do a little bit of a background investigation, and you don't need to be looking at each different suspect. This is a road to go right to the right person instead of looking at 50 different suspects trying to figure out which one it is. Let this map tell you which way to go. So hopefully this is what's going on behind the scenes right now with investigators in the Zodiac case. We've heard for 3-4 years now the rumors about DNA, the things they're doing with DNA. And the police are very tight-lipped, especially now. From what I've heard, there's some movement, some things going on behind the scenes that are positive. I had hoped that there'd be some kind of answer before the end of this year. We've only got a month left before the end of the year, so it looks like unless something happens real quick, I'll be wrong about the end of the year being solved. But maybe there's hope for 2022. But I think there's definitely no question there's things going on behind the scene. How much progress they're making and what they'll be able to find out, I don't know that. It should be interesting to see where things go.
And in this podcast, I've tried to give reasons why the 74, 78, and even the 87 letters are genuine, other than just the style of handwriting. There are less reasons to argue for letters such as the March the 13th, 1971 letter, yet people just believe this to be Zodiac based on nothing more than handwriting. Why is that, do you think?
Well,
I mean, what is there in the Los Angeles letter that you can prove definitively that is the Zodiac Killer other than just looking at it?
well, and that's the thing. I think a lot of the old letters, were ruled in or ruled out by experts, whether that be Sherwood Morrill or the FBI documents examiners. I think in the past, they've sort of ruled them in or ruled them out just based on the conclusions they came to. I don't know that they had physical evidence. So I think primarily that's why, I think a lot of people have assumed that the Los Angeles letter was real. I personally think it's a real Zodiac letter, but I don't, proof physical evidence wise, I don't know that there's anything that exists that can prove it, short of prints or DNA that they can develop. But it seems like a lot of people have just went by the official confirmed Zodiac letters based on, the opinion of the experts.
I personally think it's genuine, but like I said, it's more difficult to prove that than some of the later letters from 74 onwards. So I find it strange that people dismiss the later letters yet readily accept these sort of letters based on handwriting when we know many of the experts just disagree between themselves, as they did with the John Benet Ramsey case. Half of the people think it was the mother who wrote that 3-page ransom note, and yet a lot of people don't believe that. And these are document examiners who believe these things. So I don't know why we put so much strength in document examiners.
Well, and that's the thing. I think in 2022, what's more important than a document examiner is the DNA that's underneath an envelope seal versus a document examiner's opinion of what's on the envelope. That's physical evidence. That tells the truth versus someone's opinion about what's written on the outside of that envelope. So that's one thing we just didn't have back in the 60s or 70s. It was all based on opinion. Unless there was a fingerprint on one of those envelopes, they didn't know about DNA. So the only thing they had to go on was the opinion. So that's why I think in any of the letters, whether it's a 1969 letter all the way up to the newest possible hoaxed Zodiac letters, I think police should be making an effort to identify any and all of the authors, whether they be Zodiac or not. They can put them on a list, determine who they are, and then one by one take them off the list and say, okay, this person that authored this letter that sealed that envelope was not the Zodiac, because they were the wrong age or whatever. I think that's the first step that I would do. Again, I'm not in charge of the investigation. If I was, I'd be doing this, trying to identify each and every single author of all the letters till we find someone that we think is Zodiac, and then you could hone in on them and do a full-scale investigation.
And finally, Mike, one of the more ignorant comments from a particular Zodiac forum where the contributors stated to you regarding the podcast that there should be less raving about letters and things that have no connection to the case. This is the perfect example of somebody who believes in a set list of authenticated letters, and any communication outside this set list should be spared little time. For me, it's imperative that we examine all the communications, potentially from Zodiac, because this is the only window we have into the man and his thinking. There also may be clues within these communications. What this person, I think, is actually saying is we should discuss only letters that he thinks are genuine. What do you think about that comment?
Well, I'll say to everyone that what I told this troll on that very forum you're mentioning. He's welcome to start a podcast and talk about whatever he'd like to talk about. This is our podcast. We'll discuss what we want to discuss. And if we think this is worth exploring, this is what we're going to talk about. So I'm not going to spend too much time feeding the trolls. They're welcome to start their own podcast and talk about whatever they want to talk about.
And I would just like to mention that on December the 18th, we are releasing an interview with Joanne Getche, a very interesting interview with her recollections of Donna Lass. So I hope that people will tune into that podcast.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Just a little bit of background. I was working on another project where I was going to release this interview with Joanne, touching on the Donna Lass case, and that sort of fell through. So we decided this would be a good place to put this interview out. And Joanne is someone that has some information about Donna Lass. Obviously, she was supposed to meet with her the weekend she disappeared. And she does contradict some of the popular things that were thought to be factual in this case. So I think people will be enlightened by some of the stuff she has to say in this interview, and maybe they'll be reevaluating some of the things they previously thought about in Donna's case.
I know neither of us believe the Zodiac Killer was responsible for the abduction or possible murder of Donna Lass, but it should be an interesting interview nonetheless. It would be nice to get some more advancements in this case, however slim.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think we both agree that Donna was not a Zodiac victim. On the other hand, though, it's worth keeping an open mind and just wondering, even if Zodiac didn't abduct Donna, could he have known her? Could he have been interested in her case because he knew her? I mean, we know that Donna had friends in Vallejo and spent time in Vallejo and Vacaville, and her second cousin lived in Vallejo, was actually married to a woman named Donna Lass. So there's just enough interesting things there that tie Donna to the Vallejo area that I personally am trying to keep an open mind and explore. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that on that year-end episode. And
I would just like to finally thank Druza, who's helped me enormously with this 1978 letter, 1974 letter, and the indented writing. So I'd like to give him some thanks for his help on this matter.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone, too, that's also given us some great feedback, some positive feedback. For the couple trolls here and there that say negative things, I think the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive for the show, and I want to personally thank everyone for listening. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Colts, Crimes, and Cabernet. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
When we started Cults, Crimes, and Cabernet, it was just a conversation between two friends about true crime over a glass of wine. It quickly grew into a passion project, and Melissa and I transformed this hobby into a mission.
Our mission is to be a trusted resource while empowering others to use their voice and create a positive change for victims nationwide. After a year of covering different genres of cases, Whitney and I chose to narrow our focus and take a journey covering cold and unsolved cases in Season 3.
While our main focus will be unresolved cases, we will still be exploring the fascinating world of cults. So we invite you to pop a cork and grab a glass because we have work to do.
Cults, Crimes, and Cabernet is streaming on all major podcast platforms.